Shalom from Israel, and welcome to our Torah for the Nations weekly meeting. You know, one of the questions that we get here every now and then is, since we teach the Noahide laws, people will say, well, how come I've never heard of the Noahide laws? Like, where are they? Is there a list of the Noahide laws in the scriptures? You know, give me chapter and verse. And that is kind of our Greek mindset, our Western mindset, because we want to just see, like, these are the Noahide laws. 1, 2, 3, you know, that's the way we think they should be. But what we find out is that the Torah has stories, and when you want to understand things, you have to kind of have like eyes to see. You have to read between the lines, so to speak. So they're there, but you have to be able to see them. For instance, we notice in the stories that there's a contrast. We see that some people are called righteous and some people are called wicked. So we can deduce from that, okay, well then there must have been some kind of criteria that would make Noah righteous and the people that were drowned in the flood waters wicked. So we know that the people that drowned in the flood, they were said to have Hamas, which is like violence and stealing. They just had utter disrespect for each other. So one of the Noahide laws is the prohibition against stealing. And of course, we know that, you know, when Cain killed his brother Abel, that was wrong. We know that there was a prohibition against murder. And when Noah came out of the ark, he said it again. You know, there's a prohibition against murder. There was a prohibition against not being cruel to animals. And so they're there. And when Sarah and Abraham come on the scene, we see that they're teaching that there's a prohibition against idol worship. They're teaching the people in their community about the one true God. And then we see that there's a story in this week's Torah portion about how Sarah gets kidnapped by Pharaoh. And this Pharaoh, even though he doesn't follow the Noahide laws, he does say, when he wants to take Sarah as his own, he does ask if she's married, because there is a Noahide law that says you cannot sleep with another man's wife. And so even the Egyptian Pharaoh he asked first, well, is she married? So he had a criteria that he followed. Now, if she was married, he didn't have a problem at all murdering her husband, but he did have some standard. So that's why when we say, okay, are the Noahide laws listed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7? No, but they're there. They're there in the stories. Okay, so we're reading about Abraham and Sarah, and I love this book. I've showed it to you before. It's by a friend of mine, Leah Saul, Sisterhood of the Copper Mirrors, and she has chapters on, you know, Esther, Ruth, Miriam, and this chapter on Sarah. She says, Abraham's chosen life partner and soulmate was Sarah. It is said that when a man and woman unite as husband and wife, they become greater than they could have been separately. Abraham and Sarah knew that they were on a mission so large it would change all humanity. Their mission was to bring monotheism, the knowledge of one God, into the world. This idea was for the whole world. To fulfill their mission to awaken humanity to knowing that there is one Creator, Abraham taught the men and Sarah taught the women. So the question would be, well, what did they teach? Well, when we look in Isaiah, it's this week's half Torah, we see that it's talking about Abraham and Sarah. Isaiah is talking about Abraham and Sarah. And we have a commentary here that says, although the task that God assigned to Abraham and Sarah would not be an easy one, requiring them to oppose alone the philosophical, theological, and cultural milieu of its time, God promised them that they would ultimately be vindicated even becoming a source of blessing for all humanity. So Abraham and Sarah are on a mission. They are revolutionaries. They are teaching people to have the courage to stand alone, swim against the tide, don't do what everyone else is doing. And it's never supposed to be easy. It wasn't part of the deal. They knew that there was going to be trials, there was going to be struggles, but God tells them in the end, you're going to succeed. Okay, so Abraham and Sarah are basically teaching mankind how to be righteous, how to have a place in the world to come, in heaven. And there's this amazing imagery. When you look at wheat has 4 parts, and there's a story here or an imagery that compares the 4 parts of the wheat to 4 types of people. And so Abraham and Sarah are basically teaching people to be righteous. And so 2 types of people in this story are righteous and 2 types are wicked. Okay, so the 4 parts of the wheat, you've got the chaff, you've got the stubble, those symbolize the wicked, and you've got the kernel, and you've got the straw, and those symbolize the righteous. And the way it goes is when wheat is growing, the part that's really not needed and kind of useless and doesn't really contribute much, that's the part that grows up first and looks really big. And it talks about it's kind of like it's prideful, saying, oh, it's all about me. And it's only in the end, when the farmer comes and he separates the wheat from the chaff, that you find out who's who, what's what, and that really the whole time it's been about the little bitty kernel on the inside, and also the straw that helps is also very useful, and the straw protects the kernel. So I'm going to read this to you because I think this is great, and you can get an idea of what Sarah and Abraham's revolutionary mission was at the time. Living just totally surrounded by idolatry, lawlessness. You know, next week we're going to read about Sodom and Gomorrah. So there's just such a contrast between the kind of society that they're trying to produce and get people, you know, to do. Abraham's teaching the men, Sarah's teaching the women, they're making converts. But it can be compared to this imagery of the chaff and the wheat. Okay. All right. The Midrash notes that the imagery of chaff is used to describe the Jewish people's enemies because the less useful parts of the wheat plant grow first and largest, giving the impression that they, rather than the kernels, are the object of the planting. The tall stalk boasts, saying, "The field was sown for my sake." The long leaves boast, saying the same thing. And the tiny kernel says back to them, "Wait until the harvest. We will know for whom the field was sown. At harvest time, the farmer winnows the wheat, so the chaff will be scattered in the wind. He takes the straw and beats it on the ground, and takes the chaff and burns it. He then collects the kernels and makes a pile out of them. Similarly, the nations of the world say, 'The world was created for us,' and all the Jewish people can say is, 'Wait until the future, and then we will know for whom the world was created.'" Rabbi Shmuel Yaffe writes, "The straw represents the righteous Gentiles." And this is who Abraham and Sarah were working with. The straw represents the righteous Gentiles who keep the Noahide laws because they believe in God and that He commanded them to observe these laws. Though not the focal part of the plant, straw is beneficial to the world. Similarly, these non-Jews capably keep the world running according to God's plan and therefore have a share in the world to come. Stubble represents other semi ethical Gentiles who behave partly in accordance with God's intention, but do so only for their own philosophical or cultural reasons, since they deny either that God exists or that He gave humanity any commandments. Stubble can be used as fuel, but ultimately disintegrates. Similarly, these people do contribute somewhat to the betterment of civilization, but will not share in the world to come, since they deny God. The chaff is the least useful component of the plant, whose only use is to be discarded in order to decompose and replenish the earth. It represents those non-Jews who are without any form of religion or morality. They will cease to exist in the Messianic future. All this should serve to motivate us to disseminate the observance of the Noahide laws among our non-Jewish neighbors in order that they be privileged to have a share in the world to come. So this is in Isaiah 40 and 41, and this is just a commentary about verse 15. So we see, that we're going to have Abraham and Sarah are teaching about how to be righteous, how to, what's going to happen when the wheat and the tares are separated. And we see how it looks like it's all about the part that's growing up and growing so tall and saying, oh, it's all about us. And then at the end, we see it's the little tiny kernel and the straw that protected the kernel, that helped. These are the two groups, the Jews and the Noahides, that have a place in the world to come. So this is the mission, this revolutionary mission that Sarah and Abraham undertook. And it involved a lot of suffering. But it's not easy to be different. It's not easy to be different and, to leave behind the whole culture that you grew up in, the whole culture and the society that molded you, and to just, this Torah portion is called Lech Lecha, go to yourself. You cannot become who you're truly meant to be. You cannot reach your potential until you Lech Lecha, until you just leave it all behind. And so it's not just for Abraham and Sarah, it's for all of us. And I know you know what I'm talking about because we've all done this. So she says here that God sent Abraham and Sarah away from the land of their birth into a new land. They left all that they knew for this new place where God told them to settle. Such a journey does not come without trials and ordeals, though. And this is a theme throughout all the stories of the Torah. We're going to see this same theme, that tests and tribulations transform us and refine our character. So we can't be surprised. We get messages all the time. People are suffering. People are suffering either financially, or they're suffering physically, or they're suffering because someone very close to them is suffering. A parent has a child who's going through something. And so I was listening to a teaching by Rav Ephraim Sprecher. He's a teacher in Jerusalem. And he was saying, he quoted the book of Job that says that human beings are born for toil and trouble. And so he was just using all of these famous quotes that we all know. When the going gets tough, the tough get going. But he says that all of our troubles are tailor-made for our refinement. And he says that when our soul, our neshama, comes down from heaven and comes into our body, he said it's basically a temporary dwelling, and it has to pay rent. And so what is the currency for the rent? Is suffering. So he's the one that I got this title for, The Stairway to Heaven, because he says the stairway to heaven involves three things. It involves us keeping the commandments, the mitzvot, Torah study, and suffering. And he says, just like, we see that in the physical we have growing pains, we shouldn't think that it's anything different in the spiritual. In spiritual we have also this idea of no pain, no gain, or according to the effort is the reward. Okay. So, I was reading another article by, it's called The Challenge of Suffering and Choosing a Response to Adversity. And this is by Rebbitzin Zipporah Heller and Sarah Yocheved Rigler. And they're talking about our choosing our response. And basically, we can be a victim or a victor. And so she says, every difficulty which life presents can be viewed either as a hardship or a challenge. If we define our difficulties as hardships, then we'll respond with bitterness, rejection, depression, and either way we become a victim. If we define our difficulties as challenges, we will summon our fortitude and potentials to face the challenge. We will become a victor. I love this. She says, when a football is thrown at you, you can try to duck it, be hit by it, or you can catch the ball and run with it. So we're going to be reading the whole rest of the Torah now is just going to zoom in on Abraham and Sarah and their offspring, and it just goes from there. And all it's going to be, you're going to see just one test and trial after the other. But they say that challenges and tests can be divided into two categories: the big dramatic tests and the routine, unsensational challenges. And they compared it to, you know, the soldier on the battlefield. The big dramatic test would be, in a second, he would give his life for a fellow soldier. And then in life, in everyday life, they're standing in line in the mess hall, and the same soldier cuts in front of him, and he's just like, what are you doing? He's ready to fight him. He's, you know, just like, quit disrespecting me like that. You know, so it's kind of funny how we are. Sometimes the little everyday challenges are harder than the big dramatic ones. And I was looking at this story of Sarah, and she has a big dramatic thing happen to her, and then she has something kind of happen in her home life, and we see that she just aces the big dramatic thing that happens to her, and not so much on what happened in her home life. Okay, so here's the two tests, two of the tests that she had. There was a famine, and Sarah and Abraham had to travel out of Israel and go down to Egypt. Now, the Pharaoh there, like we were saying, they had never... Sarah looked different than most of the women in Egypt. She is said to be one of the 4 most beautiful women in the world. So naturally, Abraham saw this coming. He's just like, uh-oh, you know, say you're my sister, because he knew the drill. Like, they're going to want to know if you're married, and then if you say yes, I'm dead. So we were talking, you know, I told you earlier how they knew that you cannot sleep with a married woman, but they didn't really hesitate to kill the husband. So Sarah gets taken, and she prays for an angel to come and strike Pharaoh with some horrible disease, and he finds out that she is a married woman and he can't get rid of her fast enough, and he sends her off, but she just comes out smelling like a rose, because they become rich from it. They get all these gifts from Pharaoh, and they get sent on their way. And one of the things that came up, someone asked a question, you know, like, there's 2 incidences here. Abraham's wife gets kidnapped, and Abraham's nephew, Lot, gets kidnapped. And when his wife, Sarah, gets kidnapped, he really doesn't do anything. It's all up to Sarah to get herself out of that mess, and she does. But when Abraham's nephew, Lot, gets kidnapped, it's like Abraham turns into Rambo. And we see how they say he and only 318 men went up against 5 kings, and he rescues his nephew. So the question was, why he does nothing when his wife is kidnapped, and why he just goes all out to rescue Lot. And the answer is, when Sarah needed to be rescued, they were in Egypt, and they were outside of Israel, and it wouldn't have done Abraham any good. When Lot was kidnapped, they were inside Israel. And if you have paid attention to history of what happens when Israel goes to war in the land of Israel, like the Yom Kippur War or the Six-Day War or the raid on Entebbe, if you ever Google this stuff, it is like amazing. We are like outmanned, outgunned, and something miraculous, supernatural happens when we fight a battle in the land of Israel. So it started with Abraham going to rescue Lot, and it's still happening today. The 318 men, some say that he actually only had one guy, Eliezer, because Eliezer, the gematria of his name is 318, coincidentally. So we're not sure if it was just Abraham and his one guy, Eliezer, that went up against 5 kings, or if he had the 318 men. But either way, everyone in the world was astonished that, it was like a scene in a Rambo movie, that they just went in and rescued Lot, like so outmanned, and they won. But that's just a little side note of Sarah gets kidnapped and Lot gets kidnapped. Abraham does nothing. Abraham goes all out. But it's because of there's difference whether you're in Israel or outside of Israel. Okay, so Sarah, when she has that big dramatic test, she does very well. Okay, then we find out that Sarah and Abraham, after 10 years of marriage, they don't have a child. And so one of the ways of the laws back then was that after 10 years with no child, then there was something, we think that the surrogate thing is kind of new, but it, like Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun, because that's what the plan was, that they would, Hagar was Sarah's handmaiden. She was a spiritual person. We see later that angels appeared to her, and she learned in the tents of Sarah. And the idea was maybe that she would have the baby physically and Sarah would raise it spiritually. And then we find out that she conceived right away. And I've heard in a ladies' class that I went to that this was so that Abraham didn't have to keep trying. I mean, he just one time and she was pregnant. But then this caused Hagar to feel like, wow, maybe Sarah's not all that spiritual. Maybe Sarah's just putting on a front like she's spiritual. Maybe, why is it that I get pregnant right away? And she was judging, and she started to treat Sarah Sarah complained to Abraham. She said, why didn't you pray for me? Why didn't you pray for me? Why didn't you pray for me to have a child? And why didn't you stand up for me when I was being disrespected? And so Abraham tells her to do as she wishes. And our Torah says that Sarah was harsh with Hagar. And what Rav Sprecher said about that, he says that Sarah afflicted Hagar. And he says, so now the children of Hagar will afflict the children of Sarah. And that's still going on today. And he says the Torah doesn't cover anything up. It tells it like it is. And he says that there's only 2 people in the Torah that God named. And one of them was Ishmael. And his name means God will hear. God heard her complaints. He told her she would have a son, but that he would be a savage human being and his hand would be against the whole world. So, but on the other hand, when Sarah passed that test with the Pharaoh and prayed that the Pharaoh wouldn't be able to touch her, her future generations after her, when the women, when they all got taken down to Egypt to be slaves, the women were able to keep themselves pure and modest and separate from any of the Egyptian men. So that was in the merit of Sarah not allowing Pharaoh to touch her. Okay, so just to sum it up, you know, we shouldn't be surprised when we suffer. It's all like part of our mission. It gets us where we're going. This is really cute. This is another part of the article by called "The Challenges of Suffering." We have a prayer that we pray for our sons to be like Ephraim and Manasseh. We pray for our daughters to be like Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. And she says, okay, be like Sarah. Okay, she says, we wish you a life of childlessness, traveling from place to place with no roots, abduction by a Middle Eastern dictator, your husband taking a second wife who will become pregnant right away and scorn you, and your only son who will finally be born to you after you had given up hope to be almost sacrificed by his father. What are we wishing for this innocent girl? Wouldn't it sound better to say, don't be like Sarah, be like Gloria, go to school, marry a doctor, buy a big house, live happily ever after? Wouldn't that be better? No, because that's not what life is for. If life were for contentment and pleasure, then being like Gloria would be the ultimate blessing. Since, however, life is for rectification and growth, you know, it's for our growth, it's for our refinement, we're being educated by Hashem, then the worst thing to happen would be to be like Gloria, to leave the world no better than when one entered. Our short time that we have in this world, we need to be givers and not takers. And so this is one of the things that the Noahide laws do. They teach us to don't do to anyone else what we wouldn't want done to us, and to just keep all the basic laws of morality, to worship the one true God, and to just leave this world a better place. Always, when the suffering comes, when the trial comes, take the ball and run with it. And always be asking the question, God, what am I supposed to learn from this? Why? Because if everything that happens to us is tailor-made just for us, our trial, whatever we're going through, if this is what we need to learn, it's not really a punishment, it's more like a workshop. This is what we need to get to the next phase of our journey. And so we need to always think like that, have that emunah. Thank you, Hashem. This is exactly what I need. Easier said than done, but we just take courage from when we read these stories about Abraham and Sarah and what they did. There's such examples to us. To have that courage. I know all of you have had the courage to leave behind the culture that raised you and to come into your true potential, to become everything you're meant to be. All right, so that's Parshas Lech Lecha. Next week we'll be reading Sodom and Gomorrah, more exciting things to come. All right, I'll see you in the Zoom room maybe, okay? Bye for now. Shalom.